Ukraine is feeling the pressure from intensifying Russian attacks, and its leader, President Volodymyr Zelenskyy, is facing the most concerted internal political challenge of his presidency. But as Ukraine celebrates its 35th Independence Day this Monday, Ukraine's allies are doing all they can to show their support. A bevy of foreign leaders will be in Kyiv today, including the British Prime Minister Andy Burnham. He'll be chairing a meeting of the Coalition of the Willing. Now, that's 34 countries that have promised to help secure Ukraine in the event of a peace deal with Russia. Burnham will also announce that Britain will boost Ukraine's capacity to make its own long-range missiles. Then we've got the European Commission, which just approved more than €6 billion in financial aid for Ukraine to procure new defence systems. And all of this follows visits to Kyiv from Nordic and Baltic leaders at the weekend in a show of solidarity. Take a listen to this.
I'm really glad that I brought with me 7 Finnish defense companies from the defense industry that have been able to start working more closely with their Ukrainian counterparts.
And I have announced today that Norway's support to Ukraine next year will be at the level of this year, $9 billion, which is a record high.
Somebody has to win, and it should be Ukraine. Let's spend the time and energy in supporting Ukraine where it needs the most.
We don't come here just, for the visuals or for the symbol. The basic message from NB8 is that we stand behind Ukraine.
So the NB8 just referred to there as the Nordic Baltic 8. That's an informal regional cooperation group made up of 8 northern European countries. So lots of promises of support for Ukraine, but I'm wondering whether this helps Ukraine militarily in the short term, and does it help Volodymyr Zelenskyy with the domestic political challenges that he's facing? I'm going to be talking to our correspondent in Kyiv in just a moment, but first, let's talk to Gustav Gressel. He's going to help me answer some of those questions. He's a military and security expert at the National Defence Academy in Vienna in Austria. Welcome. Thanks so much for joining me. Now, Ukraine's allies, we've just been hearing, are clearly trying to send a message of solidarity today. How significant is this show of support at this point in the war?
Well, we have to understand that particularly the air war will get dramatic over the winter. We've heard the lack of interceptors, particularly Patriots, to intercept Russian ballistic missiles, but also increased Russian production of jet-powered drones, which are faster than the previous generation and more difficult to intercept with cheap means. So the public commitment to invest in Ukraine's defense sector to produce for Ukraine is an important show, but we have to keep in mind that most of the stuff that is decided these days, the defense industrial cooperation, and have been decided basically since last year, will yield results earliest by the next year.
OK, let's just take a closer look at the support that is being pledged right now. So we've got the European Commission, which has just approved a further €6.1 billion in financial aid for Ukraine. That's to procure new defence systems like air defence missiles, ammunitions and radars. And the EU is saying that this latest aid package came on top of €16 billion of previously approved procurement plans. Then we've got Norway planning to give another 85 billion Norwegian kroner in financial support to Ukraine in 2027. Now that's €7.8 billion in line with the amount already given in 2026. Separately, Finland and Ukraine have signed a letter of intent on manufacturing and developing unmanned systems in Finland and a memorandum of understanding for a joint venture to produce uncrewed surface vessels. And on Saturday, the French President Emmanuel Macron pledged Paris would deliver new interceptor missiles. And plus, as we mentioned, Britain's new Prime Minister Andy Burnham is going to be announcing that Britain has agreed to allow European missile manufacturer MBDA to release classified information on British-made components used in the SCALP long-range cruise missile, and that's going to help France and Ukraine establish local assembly lines for the missile, which shares British and French technology. So that's a long list of support. So again, how much of a difference will this military support make for Ukraine? You're suggesting that it won't really kick in for a while. And also, which gaps remain? Can you just talk to us about that?
So basically, the cost of war for Ukraine is roughly 70 billion a year, and that amounts for salary for the soldiers and then down to procurement. This is paid through bilateral aid and through aid via credits that are taken with the loan, or the loan is backed by the confiscated Russian assets. This is basically what the Commission pledged. Each of the package, like this 6 billion, they are agreed in advance with the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, what they are going to procure for this kind of money, what they're going to fund, and then the Commission says yes or says, I want this to be amended in that direction. So this has been agreed actually with the last outgoing defense minister, and it's now signed in paper, but that is kind of part of the ongoing rolling support for the Europeans to keep Ukraine financially afloat in this war. And the finances, at least for this year, they are the least of the problem. There is a Ukrainian army you can fund. There's drone production you can fund. There are a lot of stuff that is ongoing you can fund. The problem is that with America dropping out in 2025 due to Donald Trump, there are now capability gaps and delivery gaps, and to fill them, this takes time. There are, for example, co-production on surface-to-air interceptors, the Patriot missile replacement. This is the French, Italian, British Aster-30 missile, for example, and this is German, French, Ukrainian co-production for a local missile defense system. But of course, that will kick off later because these things need to be developed. And in case of the Aster, the long-term plan is, of course, to increase production, but we are in the early stages of the long-term plan. So the production numbers right now are, of course, insufficient. So the next thing is if you fund or if you assign a memorandum of understanding to share information, to localize production, all that makes each weapon or ammunition system cheaper if it's produced in Ukraine. It helps scaling the production. There's more demand for example, the Storm Shadow missile than there's production, but we need to take into account that also this will take time. So it's a good decision that the UK and France allow Ukraine to produce the missile or assemble the missile locally, and also to transfer technology to help Ukraine to boost its own missile production. But we need to be aware that from the signing of the contract and then to the implementation and the buildup of localized production, all that doesn't happen overnight, and it will have some lead time that we have to wait for.
So let's just listen to President Zelenskyy making clear, this was yesterday, how urgent the need for more immediate support is. Let's take a listen.
At the beginning of this year, our government, the Ministry of Defense, used funds that had been planned for the end of the year. So much of this money went to buying more drones and covering other urgent defense needs. So now we have a significant funding gap. One of the main ways to cover it is bring forward part of the European loan funding plan for next year and make it available this year. The total gap is, for today, 27 billion. So around 10 of this is needed to make sure our soldiers have weapons in January, February and March. So you have to start now to pay and to produce. Otherwise, in January, February, we will have nothing. I mean, this we will have, but not enough.
All right, so he's talking about a 27 billion euro gap, and he was saying, you know, in January and February, we need these things quickly. So what's it going to be looking like in Ukraine in January and February?
Well, this was a measure by the former Defense Minister Fedorov to speed up the increase of local drone production in order to afford the mid-range strike campaign and cripple Russia's logistics, which has by and large foiled the Russian summer offensive. But of course, this was money that was in the payment plan for Ukraine, and Ukraine basically paid out the sum or allocated the sum before it was officially agreed by the EU Commission. And that created a kind of bookkeeping gap. But the overall plan to increase this localized drone production was agreed with the European allies, and the money is there. The big 90 billion credit that is taken with the confiscated Russian or the frozen Russian money as a guarantee, that is there. So we're not talking about a real funding gap, at least not until the spring of next year. The money is there. It's just the bookkeeping wasn't done according to the perfect books. It was done according to a war emergency situation.
OK, let's talk about Moscow's reaction to all of this. It's already accused Britain of escalating the conflict. It warned that there's going to be a price for deeper involvement. How is Russia going to be reacting to all of these latest Western commitments, do you think?
Well, we see the Russian reaction to this actually since some time. These are attacks against defense industry. These are attacks against critical infrastructure. These are threats and assassination plans against key personnel in the defense industry, the tech sector, and decision makers. That will not go away. I think this will also not go away even if there is a ceasefire in Ukraine. So Western counterintelligence and police forces have to, unfortunately, live with that reality.
The increased European support we're seeing, do you see that as Europe really stepping up and preparing to take on a larger share of Ukraine's defence, given, and you mentioned it earlier, given the fact that the US has essentially stepped back? How would you describe that scenario now?
Yes, so basically the Europeans have stepped up, and that is in their own interest. If Russia would win this war in Ukraine because of a financial and military exhaustion of Ukraine, then of course the Russian army would not be demobilized. We already know that from Russian classified documents. There is no plan for demobilization. There will be a relocation of all these military forces currently deployed in Ukraine to the border with Europe, with the EU. We can expect that in this case there will be trouble. So of course the Europeans are acting in their own interest, and the provision of financial aid is the thing that can be done on the short notice. The problem is you need to be capable of translating euros into military equipment, and after 30 years of defense austerity and degrowth in terms of defense industrial and technological capability, unfortunately, Europe is not in a very good place to do that. But again, it's in Europe's best self-interest, especially as the US is an unreliable partner and nobody takes for granted Trump would live up to an Article 5 contingency to actually be able to do so. And now the support for Ukraine is basically the casus to do what Europe should have done anyway.
2.5 years ago, many analysts were wondering whether Ukraine could even survive this. Today, the question seems to be whether it can sustain a longer war of attrition. So looking ahead, what would you say will be the key factor in determining whether Ukraine can hold its ground, whether it will have the support to do that?
First, of course, the continuous European commitment to support Ukraine. Ukraine is financially and also in some key areas not completely autonomous. And the other thing is technological progress and the ability of Ukraine to preserve manpower. Ukraine has a manpower shortage more than Russia. Ukraine has less of a financial appeal to hire mercenaries or soldiers from North Korea and other countries to fight on its behalf. So this is something that Russia tries to exploit. If Ukraine finds ways and means to circumvent that problem, to to not need a huge manpower superiority to bring the war to a good end, then Ukraine can continue this war. This is still undecided. There might be things in Europe that go wrong. There might be things in Ukraine that go wrong. But Ukraine has a good chance to actually achieve its aim of preserving independence and sovereignty in this war.
Gustav Gressel from the National Defence Academy. Thank you so much for speaking to us.
You're welcome. Thank you very much.
All right, let's cross to Kyiv now, where DW's Nick Connolly is following today's Independence Day event. So, Nick, today marks the country's 35th anniversary of independence. Obviously, it's coming more than 4 years after Russia launched its full-scale invasion in 2022. So give us a sense of the mood in Ukraine today. What are people saying?
Anja, this is certainly not an ordinary Independence Day of the kind you would have seen before 2022. It is a lot more somber. There are no big events, no big parades here on Maidan Square, where I'm standing right now. That's basically a security requirement, because obviously you don't want to get too many people in one place to then have to look for shelter as soon as the air raid warnings come on. We've got lots of foreign leaders in town, but that doesn't affect most people here except for street closures. Behind me you can see lots of flags. That's the kind of impromptu memorial here on Maidan Square for fallen Ukrainian soldiers, and we've got lots of people, families I've seen in the last hour just coming up, taking pictures next to the images of their loved ones. Other people just going through the names, the dates of birth and the dates of death. So it is a kind of difficult but important day here. It's basically the most important kind of non-religious holiday of the year, but it's certainly a very kind of wartime mood here, and there's certainly no sense that 35 years is somehow a particular juncture in the way it would have been had it not been for this war. People are just trying to get by day, week for week.
Russia's been stepping up its attacks. It launched a drone attack on a shopping centre in Zelenskyy's hometown of Kryvyi, which killed 16 people just a few days ago. And July was the worst month for civilian casualties in Ukraine since the first month of Russia's full-scale invasion. So, you know, you mentioned the international leaders who are in town. We've been talking about the support that is being offered to Ukraine. But, I mean, how are people reacting to this international show of support, given the Russian attacks and the reality of the ground, their everyday lives?
I think, Anja, at this point, people would be surprised if we didn't have those leaders in town. They've got used to these big kind of diplomatic get-togethers. And if people like Andy Burnham hadn't turned up, maybe out of fear of Russian attacks on Kyiv, that would have been the big thing to worry people. As it is, I think people assume that that is what Ukraine is going to get at a time of war like this. But obviously they are clear-sighted about the fact that lots of these promises are going to take years to have any impact, right? This kind of biggest headline we've had today about the UK being willing to share the technology behind those Storm Shadow cruise missiles that have been pretty effective at destroying things like Russian command centers in occupied Crimea. That is going to take years to happen. And, you know, will Ukraine even be able to produce these weapons in Ukraine at a time where its air defenses are so depleted that it can't reliably protect important sites like that? So maybe it'll have to look for some kind of production site somewhere in a neighboring country that it can reliably access away from those Russian missiles. I think right now people are just very concerned that the government just, you know, gets the resources it needs, the money, that European money has been promised, that it's actually dispersed quickly enough that the government machine can keep on going into what's going to be a difficult winter, and also kind of look for military solutions to attack some of those Russian missile launchers just over the border, just 200-300 kilometers, you know, as the crow flies from central Kyiv, that are causing such a headache with these missile attacks that basically, you know, have little to no warning ahead of those missiles being launched. People hear the siren and, you know, within maybe 30 seconds they hear the bang. That is something that is new for Kyiv. It's a new sense of vulnerability, and people think that's probably, for the most part, the main priority.
Yeah, you mentioned the winter. I mean, obviously the temperatures plummet. Things get very, very cold in Ukraine in the winter. And as you said, a lot of these announcements we're hearing about are long-term projects. So given what Ukraine is facing right now, the attacks, what are Ukrainians telling you about, you know, their most urgent needs heading into another winter?
I mean, I think lots of this is about equipment, right? It's not necessarily about money. Ukraine has enough promises of money from international partners, but the run-in time to produce repairs, you know, spare parts for all of this infrastructure that's been taken out is years. So basically the only thing they can hope for now is things basically being handed over from stockpiles in partner countries, so there's no long procurement process and delivery. And they're looking, as they have been in recent years, to former Eastern Bloc countries that have similar technology. Some of these power stations are no longer operational in neighbouring countries, such as Poland. So the hope there that stuff can basically be just screwed off kind of decommissioned power plants and brought here as quickly as possible, maybe even stored somewhere in a safe third country until it's actually needed to prevent Russia attacking those stockpiles. But because of the air defence shortages in recent months, we're really seeing Russia, even though it's still warm, the winter's still a few months off, really going after that infrastructure, going after power plants, after water plants, after electricity and heat plants, to basically, I guess, try and create some kind of crisis situation here in the winter that brings people out on the streets and forces the political leadership here in Kyiv to basically accept all of Moscow's demands. Ukrainians have been through that before. They've managed to get through it. But without those Patriot interceptor missiles, it's going to be a whole lot harder.
Let's talk about the position that Volodymyr Zelenskyy finds himself in. Here's him speaking earlier today. Let's listen in.
Putin hopes that we are tired, but we know that he is mortal. He never understood us. Now he will not have time to. You wanted to take all our Ukraine, all our land. Instead, you lost your oil refineries, your fleet, your profits, your entire generation that you sent to the meat grinder. You wanted us erased from the map, but now you are absent from the international agenda of the future civilization. For 27 years, the head of Russia has talked about greatness, while Russia is standing in line for gasoline. We have to remain united and push them until they give in. Ukraine, Europe, America, the world.
So Zelensky sounding very bullish there. He's always clearly said his strategy is to lead the country to the end of the war and preserve an independent and sovereign state. But he's being challenged, isn't he, by the former defense minister who's called on Zelensky to hold elections. Zelensky says elections during wartime would risk dividing the country. What do Ukrainians think? I mean, is that view shared by most Ukrainians, or do you think there's a growing appetite for a debate about the country's future and leadership?
I mean, certainly Mikhailo Fedorov was a very popular Minister of Defense. We saw those protests going on for weeks after that shock sacking just in the last few weeks. I'm not sure that, though, with that call for elections, he really has taken everyone with him. There was firstly a sense that he was basically hoping to be reinstated under in his old job, maybe with more powers, and only basically risk that real breach with Zelensky when it became clear that he wasn't getting that job. So he didn't engage with those protesters for weeks. And now this call for elections, well, even if you talk to lots of opposition figures, they say this is not the time to do it. Firstly, because of the risk of political kind of infighting. That's true. There's been a kind of basically informal consensus since this war began to leave all of that to the future, even for people who are very unhappy with lots of things that Zelensky is doing, lots of the ways he's treating also people in government, his kind of personnel politics in terms of holding on to people that are friends of friends, but equally throwing out people who've done a good job just for kind of political expediency. So there's a lot of frustration there, but there is just that fear that Russia will try and play on those differences. How are you going to get soldiers, serving the same trenches to cooperate if they're thinking about who to vote for, if they're on different sides of political barricades? And then there is the technical question, right? How are you going to include and make sure that all those millions of Ukrainians out of the country, those refugees, are included? And how are you going to allow people who are out in the front lines to vote in a way that is legitimate and demonstrably tampered with, beyond doubt in terms of the vote being left as it was, but equally without forcing people to go to polling stations where they're at risk of drone attacks from the Russian side. So lots of unanswered questions, but certainly there is a sense that this call from Fedorov has kind of opened a box. I don't think anyone's expecting elections anytime soon, but he's basically created room for the opposition to start calling out Zelensky and his team more openly, and if not to call for elections, but to call for some kind of maybe inclusion of the opposition in decision-making, some kind of government of national unity. That's been talked about a lot in the past, and I'm sure the pressure for that will continue to rise.
Do you think that this international backing that we're seeing, all of the leaders in Kyiv today, do you think this sort of international support is going to help Zelensky weather the political challenges that he's facing right now?
I think certainly those images are very useful for Zelenskyy, right? It helps him to create this narrative of him being the face of Ukraine's resistance since 2022, the person who, against the odds, didn't take that taxi that was offered him by the Americans and asked for weapons and managed to hold on to this country. And so obviously, him being the face of Ukraine, its war effort, and basically implying to Ukrainians that if they get rid of him while this war is still not resolved, then that international support will be a lot less reliable and a lot less kind of automatic than it has been up till now. But I think the problems are mounting. He is making political mistakes. He has brought people who were previously willing to go with him up against him, and we expect more corruption revelations in the next few weeks. That's the kind of signal from the anti-corruption organisations here that there is more to come, that they've only so far published some of what they found. So this is, a very, very difficult time for President Zelenskyy at a time when, with those Patriot interceptor missiles in such extreme demand and so few stocks left, people here in Kyiv are feeling a lot more vulnerable.
Nick Connolly in Kyiv, thanks so much for bringing us up to date, Nick. So what do you think? Where does Ukraine stand 35 years after becoming an independent state? Will Europe's support be enough to secure its independence? Let us know in the comments and see you next time. Thanks for watching.